Before sunrise on May 13, 1862, a Confederate steamer moved through Charleston Harbor with its lights low and its engine breathing into the dark. It carried heavy guns, military supplies, and the confidence of a city that believed itself impossible to escape, because every fort, every signal, and every gun was pointed outward. But at the wheel was not a Confederate officer. It was an enslaved 23-year-old harbor worker named Robert Smalls, a man the law refused to call a pilot, even though the ship depended on his skill. His wife and children were hidden on board, silent in the shadows, where one cry from a child could destroy the entire plan. So were other enslaved families, waiting in the dark while Confederate batteries watched the water and soldiers listened for the normal signals of a normal night. Smalls put on the captain's straw hat, copied his posture, and steered toward the first checkpoint as if he belonged to the power that owned him. If one guard looked too closely, everyone on that ship could be killed, imprisoned, or sold away forever as punishment for daring to become human in public. But the signal passed. The fort let the ship continue. The second fort answered the same way. The harbor mouth was opening, and Charleston was waking too slowly to stop them. And then Robert Smalls sailed the Confederate ship out of slavery, carrying his family, his crew, and a future the Confederacy never intended them to have. This is not a legend invented after the fact, polished into myth because history needed a hero. The ship was the Planter, a real Confederate steam transport working in Charleston Harbor, moving troops, weapons, and supplies for the rebellion. And the man who took it had learned the harbor by being forced to serve the system that trapped him, day after day, tide after tide. Robert Smalls was born enslaved in Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1839, into a coastal world of marshes, markets, plantation wealth, and violence. As a boy, he was hired out in Charleston, where slavery was not only a plantation system, but an urban economy of docks, hotels, workshops, warehouses, and ships. He worked on docks, in hotels, and eventually on boats, absorbing the city's hidden map through labor that was supposed to keep him powerless. The water became his classroom, and the harbor became a textbook no one could take away from him. Currents, sandbars, forts, signals, the timing of patrols, the habits of white officers who thought the people serving them were invisible. By the Civil War, Smalls was working on the Planter as a wheelman, the person whose hands actually guided the vessel through dangerous water. He could not legally be called a pilot under Confederate rules, because admitting his expertise would have contradicted the entire racial order. But in practice, he knew how to move the ship, how to read the tide, and how to sound like routine in a harbor built on suspicion. That difference, between what the law admitted and what reality required, became his opening, and he waited for the system to make a mistake. On the night of May 12th, the white officers of the Planter left the vessel and slept ashore, trusting the world they had built to stay obedient until morning. That decision broke their own military orders, but arrogance often looks like confidence right before it becomes evidence. It also handed Robert Smalls a narrow door, the kind history opens for only a few minutes. He and the black crew moved quietly, not as passengers in someone else's rescue, but as the authors of their own operation. They picked up their families from a nearby wharf, brought them into the shadows, then turned the ship toward the harbor mouth. They did not simply flee. Flight alone would not pass the forts. They performed the Confederacy back to itself, using its own habits, hierarchy, and signals as camouflage. He gave the correct whistle signals, held the routine pace, and kept the silhouette the guards expected to see. He passed Fort Johnson, where a suspicious look could have turned the harbor into a killing ground. He passed Fort Sumter, the symbol of the war itself, where the first shots had announced that slavery would rather burn the country than lose power. Every yard of water was a bet against death, and every second made the return route smaller. Behind him was enslavement, slave markets, legal ownership, and the threat that his family could be separated by sale. Ahead of him were Union blockading ships that might mistake the Planter for an attack and fire before they understood what they were seeing. So when the Confederate flag came down, a white sheet went up, a homemade signal of surrender, hope, and desperate precision. The Union crew saw it, hesitated, and held their fire. Robert Smalls delivered the Planter, its cargo, its guns, and valuable Confederate signal information to the United States Navy. But his greatest cargo was human. The people slavery had reduced to property, now standing on the edge of freedom. His wife Hannah and their children were among them. Names the law had treated as inventory, now crossing open water as people. Northern newspapers turned him into a sensation, because the story was too dramatic to ignore and too politically useful to bury. For abolitionists, Smalls was living proof against one of slavery's ugliest lies, that enslaved people lacked courage, intelligence, or the will to be free. Luck did not steal the planter. Study did. Timing did. A crew that refused to be background in their own lives. He had learned the harbor by serving it. That morning, the harbor finally let him leave. Congress rewarded the crew, though the money was smaller than many supporters believed they deserved for delivering a vessel and intelligence of such value. Smalls met President Abraham Lincoln, carrying a story that cut through theory and made black military service impossible to dismiss. And historians credit stories like his with helping persuade the Union to enlist black soldiers, not as symbols, but as fighting men. Then comes the part most short versions skip, because the escape is cinematic and the aftermath is harder to compress. Robert Smalls did not vanish after the escape, cash the reward, and disappear into a quiet life. He returned to war service, piloted Union vessels, and kept risking his life along the southern coast, where every channel remembered Confederate fire. In one later battle, when a white captain reportedly abandoned his post, Smalls took command under fire and helped save the vessel. After the Civil War, he did something even harder than stealing a ship from a sleeping crew. He tried to build a democracy where slavery had just been defeated and where many former Confederates were already organizing to regain control. Smalls bought the house in Beaufort associated with his former enslavers, turning a place of domination into a statement of ownership and return. Then he helped write South Carolina's new Constitution during Reconstruction, in a convention where formerly enslaved people demanded schools, rights, and representation. He fought for public education, voting rights, land, labor dignity, and political power for people who had been told citizenship was not for them. And he served in the United States Congress, speaking from inside the government that had once protected the system that owned him. That is why the story does not end at the harbor mouth. The theft of the planter was the public beginning of everything that followed: war service, Reconstruction, and a seat in Congress. Strategic, brave, political, a life no myth could flatten into victimhood. A life where the people treated as cargo became captains, soldiers, voters, lawmakers, and authors of their own future. Today, South Carolina is moving to honor him with a monument on its State House grounds, a recognition that arrives more than a century after his death. And maybe that is late, but it is not too late to remember him correctly. Not as a footnote, not as a lucky fugitive, but as one of the boldest architects of his own freedom. The complete sources are in our reading room. Subscribe to Legacy in Strokes and tell us who should be next: Ida B. Wells, Bessie Coleman, or Susan LaFlèche Picotte.